This morning. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Kate Company, Dr. Company. I am one of the two kind of co-sponsors or co-leaders of the AltAc workshop series that we're running right now through the ASC Division on Corrections and Sentencing. Thank you all for being here this morning, especially our esteemed guest, Dr. Jason Wilks. Thank you so much. I know kind of reading bios is a little bit awkward, but I do want to just say a couple quick words. Dr. Jason Wilks is a public management specialist at the InterAmerican Development Bank, where he works with government authorities throughout Latin America and the Caribbean to develop innovative solutions to development challenges. Prior to his current position with the IADB, Dr. Wilks has worked in various capacities, which I will not belabor, but I do want to mention one specifically, that you were previously the manager of program and policy evaluation with the Ministry of National Security in Jamaica. So clearly, Dr. Wilks' work knows no bounds, neither country or anything else. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today, Dr. Wilks. We are so happy to have you here. I'm just going to jump right into it because we've always got a lot of information to cover, and I know with you this is going to be a great conversation. So Dr. Wilks, you're the first AltAc rock star that we've chatted with here on the AltAc series that works in the international research and policy space. So we're super excited to be having this conversation today. As mentioned briefly, you've worked in various capacities within the AltAc space, within the international AltAc space. Can you tell us a bit about your background? How did you get to your current position?
Sure. So first off, thank you, Kate, for having me here. It's definitely a pleasure. I've really been looking forward to this because we've been talking about this for a few months now, and really being able to speak and share with our colleagues or grad students is really, I think, the highlight for my week. So I want to thank you again and thank the grad students for taking time to be a part of this conversation. So to your question, Kate, I think, in terms of how I came about to where I'm at today, it really is, I think, a conversation of trying to span boundaries as much as possible. I see myself very much as a policy practitioner, right? Someone who understands the operational elements of working to improve lives, working in government, working in academia, but also taking it also to the policy level, which I think is really important, right? Because it's one thing to understand programs and the actual day-to-day, but then to take it to a much more global level and understand policy, how it's developed, how it's actually conceived and implemented, I think is equally important. And so, thinking over my career, I started in Jamaica, as you rightly said, started, in what we call Jamaica's Central Planning Agency, the Planning Institute of Jamaica. And working on issues at that policy level, I think really afforded me a great opportunity to understand how things interconnect in government. And taking that experience, I transitioned into national security as a real focus area that was of importance to me, and we can talk about that more. And from there was, I think, just a wonderful experience of really contending with real life challenges, real issues of essentially, national security and public safety. And from there, really gaining an understanding of both the value added of research and academia, but also sometimes the challenges that confront you as a researcher, as a practitioner. And it actually stirred me to go and get more training, to actually go back to grad school and complete my doctoral studies. And, in that sense, I felt in some ways I'd be more equipped to answer some of the issues that I saw being raised in my experience in national security. But it's actually amazing because it actually opened up a whole new world to me in terms of what research and academia can provide. And I've really started to spend more, I think, of a fair share of my career building out that experience from grad school, having worked, as you said, in government, but then also working in academia. During grad school, I was fortunate enough to work at Harvard in the Kennedy School's criminal justice program for a few years, doing international research, covering multiple countries, just looking at how justice and security are measured differently and in a comparative sense. And that has really, I think, facilitated a lot more in terms of just taking that skill set into different contexts. So having worked in places as diverse as Ethiopia, then being able to transition and do comparative research in Central America, and presently where I'm at now, which is the Caribbean, which is kind of coming back home. It's really, I think, a real story of taking policy and practice, adding research to it, but always being mindful of how those three dynamics interplay with each other.
So interesting. It's kind of a good segue. You mentioned your doctoral work. You did your PhD in political science at Florida State.
Correct.
That's a pretty traditional degree. That's a pretty traditional program, pretty traditional university. But you ended up working a very sort of different sort of position in this kind of AltAc international justice policy research space. Take us on that journey with you. What kind of experiences did you seek out during your doctoral training that set you up on a pathway? I mean, I guess you were already working in that international space and decided you wanted more of the research skill set, but tell us a little bit about how that came about.
No, I think you're exactly right, Kate. There was always a tension, I think, in terms of from the onset, as you rightly said, FSU, the political science program, they're very, I think, upfront, at least at the time, to say, listen, we are about producing academics. So if you're coming here, we're heavy on quants. That's what we do. We're not really about, the praxis or the application side. And I remember the first year advisor saying, listen, that's what you're coming into. And I took it as a very fair warning, but I also said to them, that's exactly what I wanted. Because, sorry, it's a useful kind of tangent. The experience that I think really made me want to go to academia and do my doctoral studies was working with a criminologist who was in Jamaica as a consultant, Andres Rengifo at Rutgers. And Andres and I were working to support the police on developing internal measures of performance to gauge and reward police officers. And we were crunching data, looking at data in all these different ways. And we struck on this very nice innovation of just how you might be able to use what police do naturally, which is investigate and patrol, and use it as a metric to show when they actually deliver some desirable output. When there's an arrest, when there's a seizure, when there's something meaningful that's achieved, and look at those ratios across divisions, across respective units, to really see how commanders are deploying their resources efficiently. And I mean, it's a very simple concept, but it was also very succinct. And it captured the attention of the persons in the force. We still use it today, more than 12 years later. But all it really was, Kate, was a pivot table. It was literally taking data in Excel and visualizing it differently. But it said to me at the time that, listen, there's certain skill sets that you gain out of grad school that are fairly intuitive, fairly simplistic as we understand it. But in the actual world of operations and practice, that change, that shift can really reset how an organization treats with its performance issues. So I say all that to say, I came into grad school with that mindset that, hey, there are all these cool little techniques, statistical tools and models that I can bring back to the world of practice. And in many ways, I think Florida State fulfilled that. They allowed me to still continue doing evaluation work. So I did consultancies during grad school. And it's not like I was a really good consultant either. A lot of this was learning on the job. A lot of this was taking a course I just completed. I said, okay, let me test that model in a real world setting. Let me take my experience with matching and try that out using this survey I just got the government to do in Trinidad and Tobago. So it was always, I think, really being mindful that the value add that I brought to FSU was my real world experiences, but the FSU also gave me the ability to go back to the real world with new tools, with new understandings. I think one of the really cool things that I really want to share this too is the programs, I think, whether it's criminology, criminal justice, public administration, political science, where they focus on quantitative research, I think there's a really nice nexus for building off that in a unique way. And I'm going to be a little bit more specific to say, um, ICPSR, for example, University of Michigan, it's a terrific program known for building up our quantitative skills. And I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to go there. Um, but I took one of the courses in race and ethnicity methodologies. And at the time, I remember faculty at FSU said, that's probably not the best use of one of the courses to take. But I felt it really was, because I felt the issues of race and ethnicity, how we treat with it across those disciplines, across the social sciences, it's not nuanced enough, right? Based off of my real world experiences, just taking up variable like race and how we might, dichotomize it or do different things with it, I felt like it was doing too much of a disservice, right, to the potential to learn how to address these issues that are race related. So to me, it was really about taking opportunities that are presented in grad school and still finding ways to pursue whatever the research goal or research ambition that you have is, right? Make sure it's relevant to what you want to do.
I think that's a great point. I also love and want to stress again how you mentioned that you brought specific things into FSU and you also got things out of it. I think that's something that we don't really think about that much, that we bring with us when we start PhD programs, we bring with us a host of experiences that other folks haven't had, including the faculty at the department. And that can really strengthen. And in your case, I mean, that what you talked about just with, we do completely not measure race and ethnicity. We don't conceptualize or measure that appropriately. And just all these connections that you've made, I just wanted to stress again that it's important to consider as the person going into one of these programs, that you bring a host of experiences to them that are really, really important, that should inform what you decide to do with your program and how you specialize. And that it's sometimes we're a little bit of trailblazers. I also did things in my program where I had faculty members suggest that is probably not the best use of time, use of department resources, and that sort of thing. But to get me to where I am now, it was really, really helpful, and I had to advocate for that. And I think it's important to remember that this whole series is about breaking out of that mold and stressing that it's okay to not do that same thing. It's okay to think about things differently. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for that reminder, because it's so important, and I think it's forgotten a lot, unfortunately.
Well said, Kate. Well said.
So I want to ask you kind of a hard question that we've chatted with a couple of our rock stars, and that's this concept of positionality, right? Mm-hmm. So we're all people. We have our own values, we have our own prior experiences, and we have to balance that as a scientist. I have to balance my views with being objective and being apolitical, and that takes work to do at times. So I don't want to get too personal or anything here, but were there some life experiences that set you on this track, and how do you kind of reconcile that? How do you think about that positionality thing? What's the big question here? What's your why behind the international research, and how you situate yourself within that? So like I said, super straightforward and easy question.
Yeah, that's a fairly easy question. I'll be honest, right? I almost wholly reject this idea of objectivity, right? In the sense that academia, I think, has that veneer of being objective, but in every which way, right? The discussions that we have are within a political context, right? The institutions that we work within or that we were trained by have their politics, whether they're overt or subversive. And I found, and this is really where, going into political science, I found that it's really wrestling with that really allows you to make change, right? Um, I think in terms of what really made me do what I'm doing is one, I started out very, bushy-tailed, kind of like very naive, this idea that I want to help people. My first degree was actually in psychology. And then the thought was, well, you can help more if you did public administration. So my master's was then in public administration. And then I decided I wanted to go back, work in government in Jamaica for a few years. I mean, I was born in the States, but I was able, having grown up in Jamaica, to kind of, traverse both societies fairly easily. But I felt I need to go back to Jamaica because that's where there was a real need. But as I said, I was confronted by a lot of challenges where, you gave terrific policy advice, in terms of from a technical perspective, the analysis was sound, it was clear, it was cogent, but the political imperatives at the time still influenced what actually took place for business. And I recall at the time, it was a real sound rebuttal to me, right? And it made me say, you know what, no, I need to understand how the political dynamics shift and influence policy so that I can control for that, so that I can account for that and ensure that, seriously the outcomes I want to see in terms of people being enriched and lives being developed is actually achieved. So to me, I feel when research engages with a political question, it takes on an added advantage and it makes it more meaningful in a sense, right? So that's really how I came to be in this space because the next iteration for me is, well, how do you do this not just at a collective level, but also at the most global level, working through institutions like the IADB, that's the main financier of governments in Latin America and the Caribbean. That allows me enough scope as well to try and make influence in the areas that I cover. So yeah, it's always about being thoughtful about the politics and still making sure that my ambitions to see meaningful amelioration of lives, still making sure that that's at the forefront of what I do.
It's really fascinating. I have a question a couple down that I'm going to jump to.
Yeah.
But let me find it. Let me find it. Okay, so perfect segue. I'm jumping forward a little bit, but one thing that I've been thinking about when preparing for our discussion today is the extent to which what we look at in the US kind of parallels or diverges from what can or should be done in an international context. So what I mean is, I have information on crim theory and research methods and the criminal justice system from a very American lens. So is it appropriate for me as an American trained in the US system, both subject matter wise, US criminal justice system and the US higher education system where I learned my research skills? Is it appropriate for me to just apply an American lens of theory and research methods to an international context? Or is it more important to have kind of like a grounded theory approach to problem solving, like you're talking about, where you focus on really the local level?
Yeah. There's a kind of nuanced answer to this, right? I'll be honest to say that currently in the international domain, criminal justice is still determined primarily by US criminal justice policy and practice, right? Um, you go pretty much into any developing country space, and when they talk about innovation, it's primarily a policy or practice that they have learned or seen from the US context, right? Um, and one of the things that always amazes me is, community policing, even this week, is raised by some of my government counterparts as an area where they want to do work in as an innovative effort. And community policing has been in the public space now, at least in the US, for 30 plus years, as a defined concept, to the point where it's probably even now we're transitioning away from community policing. So the US is still very much an agenda setting agent in the criminal justice discussion. And I think that if you were to go in there with just your understanding from research and from your institutional setting, you'd be fine, right? But I think those colleagues, those academic practitioners that I work with who make a difference and who we enjoy working with are those who are both reflective and reflexive, right? They're both thoughtful about where their positionality places them, you know, in terms of coming into a new context, what are their biases, what are their expectations, what are their assumptions, and being really thoughtful about that. And then also being reflexive, being willing to adjust that. Right? I think if you carry both of those things with you, you do very well. And you kind of do end up with that whole inductive kind of grounded approach of how you build out your theory. Based again on what you've learned before, but how it fits or how it doesn't fit within a new context.
That's really interesting. I know when we were when we had a conversation in advance of this chat today, when this came up, I had mentioned that in the context of criminogenic needs, you know, there's these 8 criminogenic needs that you focus on that are going to lower risk level and everything. But at a more basic level, if you think about if somebody doesn't have housing or food, those might be some of the more proximate things that you need to address before you can start to think about identifying or modifying criminogenic thinking patterns and substance use in those sorts of things. So I want to apply that to kind of like policy level problems in an international context. So say I'm a drug court researcher or something, and I want to bring a drug court model to a problem-solving court model to a new nation that doesn't have this sort of model. But they have more, but they're having, you know, tons of gun violence problems. People are there's just tons of violence happening that at the policy level, it's necessary for some sort of specialty court, but the criminal justice actors and the people involved in the justice system are just trying to stop the violence before they can even start to think about this new sort of program introduction. So that's one of the things that I was kind of thinking about. Like, if I'm a researcher and I want to do this sort of thing, or I want to implement a new policy or program somewhere, do I have to be, I like what you said, reflexive in that maybe I come into the nation or to the government group that I'm working with and see that there's some other things that need to be addressed first. So that's just what are your thoughts on that?
No, great. I think, Kate, how you kind of explicated that, how you kind of explained that. There's a sense in which you can work within a set research agenda. You can have a very clear idea of the research questions that you have, that you want to explore in the context. But I would always encourage that in the international setting, the dynamics shift so much and so quickly, right? That you have to really exude patience. You really have to be patient because, for example, you work with a certain commissioner of police to get a certain study underway. But within a year or two, the commissioner is forced out, and there's a new commissioner with a whole different set of priorities and a whole different set of urgencies that makes your research now take a secondary place. And I would always encourage, academics working in these spaces to be patient, to make sure that you have your research agenda, sure, but make sure you're doing other things. Make sure that you're not wholly beholden to making sure that this grant or this study, that it basically is what you need to propel or basically achieve some career outcome, right? It's not the most positive advice to say to people that, hey, working in these spaces, you're working at your own peril, but I think it's a fair assumption because I've seen terrific scholars, come into this space, have really good, sound conversations, and even get good research done, but it doesn't pick up again for another 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, right? And you have to find ways to make better use of that time, even as those processes are taking place. that's one thing I want to say. The other element I think is really important is, you know, when you are doing research in these spaces, you're going to be tempted a lot to, um, how do I put it? You're going to be tempted a lot to think about how these things can reflect back on the US context, right? How do you tell these stories in a way that you can come back to America and share this research, share this science? And I think that that is actually something that people might feel conflicted about, but I think it's actually a very, very good thing because oftentimes we engage with developing world context in a very much subjective manner, right? It's very much, you know, the idea of we're exploring it, we're examining it, but they're very much still the object of the subject. And I've seen in more recent times efforts, albeit nascent, albeit still very much in the early stages, but I see more and more efforts to take back lessons learned from these contexts to North America. And if it's only in a comparative landscape, I think that's a terrific, terrific approach. And there's a lot of potential in that space because you really do get to talk out certain counterfactuals, right? If you have, for example, a context of the Caribbean where, um, unlike in America, where persons are fairly comfortable about the police not killing people, right? There's, you know, of course, you have different groups who might argue, but most persons would prefer for the police not to kill criminals while accosting them. In the Caribbean, the research has shown and public survey data shows consistently that people would actually prefer that police eliminate criminal elements by whatever means necessary. And you can imagine that level of punitive perspective, it puts undue pressure on politicians, on technocrats and bureaucrats in terms of the kind of design space that they have, right? They can't do the kind of innovations because the public will be like, well, that approach is not killing anyone. And I'm being that harsh because this is really a challenge that I face consistently. I'll speak with a minister of national security and he'll be like, Jason, I would love to do this reform effort and help with reintegration. But if I take this into the public domain, I'm going to get hammered as being too soft. And the opposition is going to definitely take advantage of that. And because of that, he's not able to move or she's not able to move. So I'm putting forward this idea that, you know, by doing these analysis and bringing it back to the US, for example, you are changing that narrative space and doing it in such a way where as it becomes more common to talk about it in the US, you actually find out that in some ways that frees up the conversation back in the Caribbean. So it's really a South-South exchange and it's also a South-North exchange that I think can really help in the long run if we promote that.
That's really interesting. Definitely things I've never thought about that you are just sprinkling all over this conversation. And one of those things is, you know, in the work that I do as a researcher embedded in a Department of Corrections here, we see a lot of connection between public opinion and legislative will in order to implement different policies.
Right.
And I honestly just didn't even think about that within the international context, that, you know, public opinion could, just like it does in the US, be at odds with reform efforts that legislators and different government entities want to put into place. And again, thank you so much for just opening my eyes to so many different things during this conversation.
Jump in here real quickly because we have a question for Dr. Wilks about, to this point, is this idea that if you want to work in international spaces, Caribbean or otherwise, is there advice for keeping like abreast of what's happening at those local levels, so that way you can be attuned to kind of local issues while also bringing your own knowledge of American systems to them?
Oh, that's a great question, Shannon. You know, it's interesting because I find increasingly right now the spaces for dialogue criminal justice issues in the international sphere are atrophying. It's an unfortunate reality that right now, for example, the World Bank, they had a very comprehensive and robust kind of division around criminal justice matters, but they have folded that now. And it's a sign of the times where increasingly there's a question about whether or not the programs and solutions that were very dominant 10 years ago still have relevance. Right? So there aren't as many, for example, international fora for those discussions. That's one reality, and I think that's important to note. But in light of that, I think for a grad student who's interested in these spaces, it goes down to two things. One, networking. It's about, establishing collegial relationships with persons like myself, persons who operate in the space, who in many ways actually manage, what the agenda might look like for their respective institutions. And making sure that you keep abreast of what they're dealing with, what their issues are, and have that dialogue going. The second, again, goes back to what I'm really promoting as well, which is creating that fora in the US context, creating opportunities for cross-national learning, for South-North exchanges, because I think the more that there's a space for that, it's going to redound to the benefit of the larger narrative, the larger dialogue, the larger space for those conversations.
Yeah, I know this is a little bit different, but my agency has a partnership with the Norwegian prison system. Right. And we have correctional officers and parts of our executive teams that have gone to Norway. Some of the Norwegian folks have come to Oregon, to the US, and we're kind of mutually learning from each other and kind of coming to some joint understandings about kind of just punishment and imprisonment and how to make people into good neighbors when they leave our facilities. So I love that you're stressing the importance of that, and I'm all for it, jumping on that bandwagon with you for sure. I have never been more interested in anything comparative as I am at this exact moment in life. So you mentioned agenda setting. So I'm gonna take us in that direction really fast. So with some of the AltAc rock stars that we've talked with, their work takes more of an applied research orientation. So I'm thinking like Shannon and Brian Lovins at JSP, me embedded in an agency, whereas other research, applied research work, or I guess other research work, looks more like agenda setting. So for the AltAc participants, I'm thinking back to our conversation with Maureen McGough, where she really talked about, it's not so much being in the weeds, doing the research, answering the research questions, as much as creating the priority areas and really digging into what matters right now. So how would you place the work at IADB? I know in your specific position, you're a public services management specialist, I think. So kind of what does that mean, and how do you situate your work within that kind of more, I guess, continuum of applied work versus kind of the larger agenda setting?
Yeah, no, great question, Kate. I think in some ways I had to discover my role by doing it, by performing it, because certainly during the interview, everything that I thought was on the job description wasn't very applicable. I was envisioning a role where I was going to be a technical expert that would advise governments, kind of drop in occasionally and give, good, sound technical advice in a particular problematic area. But my day-to-day is really more run by being a team leader for different investment operations across Latin America and the Caribbean. So for example, we might have a loan that we give to a country to support institutional reforms in justice. And that might be for 10 million US dollars. My role is to make sure that how those resources are expended, it reflects banks' policies, and it's really the best possible expenditure, right? Based on what we understand in terms of the literature, based on what we understand in terms of practice. So oftentimes, my experience of when I encounter researchers in the initial design stages, right? When you really want to understand if we're going to do something to address gender-based violence, for example, what is the current research saying? And then using my academic understanding to try and par out those examples or those findings that are not going to be relevant, right? And really look at those that are relevant to the context that can be brought in as being instructive, and then building the program out on that. Once you get through the design stage, I think it really is about agenda setting, because then it's really about making sure that in terms of how the government implements, you keep them in a certain space where their interests are always maintained, but there's a sense in which the program is also executed properly. And by that I mean there's sometimes a tension, right? Where sometimes governments working off, say, a electoral cycle will want to accelerate something or decelerate some element of the policy reform, right? There might be something that might, as we were saying earlier, there might be something that might be attractive and they don't want to actually execute that element of the component because it might have an electoral consequence. And my role at that time is to work with them, persuade them, be a soothsayer in some ways to help them still have the momentum going forward in that space, right? A part of that is showing them good data about how this will redound to their benefits. And another part is also just good diplomacy, relationship building. And I think that too is also because of my academic training. Agenda setting for me is not just about being able to determine what is going to be the next step, but it's also about how do you talk with people about what that next step is? How do you engage in a way where you facilitate a really healthy discussion that is respectful, right? Is not talking down to them, and in some ways encourages them to kind of be more ambitious, more thoughtful, right? So for me, agenda setting is really that as well. And yeah, that's where I think much of my work is.
So interesting. So what kind of subject matter areas tend to be important to your group, as well as maybe even if you could take a step back and just kind of what sort of subject matters are important in an international policy and research context in general? I know you mentioned that unfortunately it looks like the kind of public safety realm might be atrophying. So are you seeing more transnational stuff? What are you seeing the trends look like? Or can you forecast what they might look like?
I'll say this, Kate, even as I do believe that certainly the institutions and programs that were there 5-10 years ago are either kind of cycling down or completely removed. It's also because there's creating now a new dynamic. There's actually, I think, the end of an epoch and we're moving into another space. Mm-hmm. One of them you rightly said, I think transnational crime and transnational criminal justice is becoming increasingly relevant. In almost every conversation I have with a government counterpart, whether it's in Latin America or the Caribbean, they're really struggling with how do I coordinate? How do I get persons outside of criminal justice to pay attention to what I'm dealing with and work with me to achieve it, right? And that extends both within government, but outside of government, right? When you have issues like migration and how you might have trafficking in persons as a real key component of that. How do governments spend time, building on collaborative, collective solutions to these issues is really becoming more and more a feature of this space of criminal justice. Interestingly too, a new dynamic is, again, based on this idea of stretching, that the idea of what is relevant for criminal justice is also expanded. These days, you're hearing more and more discussions of climate change in criminal justice, which, again, 5-10 years ago, you might not have thought of that. But when you think of the context like Brazil or Colombia, which are Amazonian countries, and some of the biggest challenges they have is around illegal gold, illegal mining, illegal logging, and the fact that in so many cases that actually creates persons being killed or assassinated because of their activism against, corporations, against cartels. It really does drive a lot of this security dialogue by saying, hey, we need to look at environmental justice and how we might be able to do better jobs in terms of strengthening government surveillance capacity there. Another area that I think is becoming increasingly important too is in the diversity and gender space. I think as we have more and more thoughtful discussions of the importance of providing spaces for minorities, women, people of color, to come into these settings, right? That is also trickling more and more into criminal justice, right? We're really reassessing, I think in very positive ways, how issues like race reflect, not just in North America, but similarly like in Brazil or in Colombia, the minorities there that might be of Afro descent. How are justice systems there? Indigenous communities, whether they be persons who are Maroons or persons who might be Native American, how do their rights and their justice systems get respected and acknowledged within the formal justice sector? These are issues that I'm increasingly being asked to look at. So it's really, I think, positive because whereas the old systems are kind of atrophying or being, moved out, there's these new conversations that I think are going to drive a lot of the energy the next 5-10 year period.
I love that you said, and I actually wrote down with 5 exclamation points after it, what is relevant to criminal justice is changing. Yeah. I love that. I know that's what my agency thinks. That's what I think. I think that's what a lot of criminal justice reformers think. But I just love that you said it in those words. And I'm going to remember that with all 5 exclamation points. So here's a pretty easy question. And you talked about things that you're asked to look at. So how are projects initiated? I know you said you help with kind of managing and overseeing loans, but so like in general, in the international AltAc kind of research and policy space, how would projects be initiated? Who are your stakeholders? And kind of who do you talk to when you are preparing your deliverables? Who's your audience?
Great questions. I think, stakeholders, I'll tell you a little about that. But one of the things I always say is my work is really around just conversation. It's almost kind of anticlimactic, but when I really think about it in fairness, we have this term in the bank where we say, have dialogue with the government. And that's really essentially what we do. Our work is really at the behest and in deference to whatever the government's priorities are. And IADB is no different from the World Bank, no different from the African Development Bank or the Islamic Development Bank in this space. There's always a desire and a need to hear what the government wants and has prioritized because they are the duly recognized authority for that nation state, and then fit within that, work within that. It's not always what you like to do, right? It's not always what you think is important, but that is always a starting place because oftentimes that is where, if there's any meaningful change, it can be sustained. The government has taken it on and owned it. If it hasn't done that, then you can certainly do the research. You can create an innovative pilot, but if it doesn't have that buy-in, it withers on your branch. So for us, our work really starts with going to government, asking what's important for you? What's the issues that you have right now? And in terms of stakeholders, I laugh because as much as the government is our primary stakeholder in the bank, it goes back to what I've learned about from political science, that you also have to think about who are the vested interests of the government has to also account for in their decision calculus, who are the persons who influence government. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, that could be private sector actors within the national setting, but just as equally, and I would probably argue as more likely in the development space around criminal justice, it is international actors. It's the US State Department. It is the purveyors or determiners of the trafficking in persons reports, or the counter narcotics report or the counter trafficking and financial crimes report. Those reports really do help set the agenda, because the government being placed on tier 1 versus tier 2 will also determine what kind of concessionary loans they get in the international market. And those are sometimes the real trigger points in terms of influencing our policy conversation. So stakeholders for us is much broader. Sometimes we're having conversations with NGOs and civil society, and sometimes we're having conversations with private sector. And sometimes it's going back to these international partners to say, well, what's the scoring you're going to give to this country? Because based on that scoring, we'll know if that country has an interest in talking about these issues more substantively or not.
That's so interesting. Thinking about sharing your knowledge and your plans and your designs with such a broad audience. I'm just thinking back to if I was in that position coming out of my PhD program, my program did an amazing job of teaching me to do an ASC presentation. It did not do an amazing job of teaching me how to have that conversation at all. So it's just so interesting to think about all the different things that go into what research means and policy development means within this context, and how we can that's not the right word, how we can refine our soft skills in really just getting things done and having those conversations.
For sure, Kate. I mean, if there's any advice I could give to a grad student who's interested in working in this space, it's kind of counterintuitive, but I think it's true. Teach. Make sure that your teaching experience is there. Because in so many ways, I think my diplomacy, my ability to break down concepts and translate them for an audience is driven by my experience teaching, right? We always laugh about undergrads not being the most studious or the most, prepared and all these jokes. But in a lot of ways, that mirrors the context in which you operate in these spaces, where you have stakeholders who are not always most informed, they're occupied with different things. And it's how do you, one, capture their interests and then explain it in a way that is precise enough, but simple enough for them to capture it, gain the gist, and get their buy-in. So I always say teaching is one of those things that we don't always prioritize, but it's very, very important. It's, I would say, more important than the quantitative skill sets, the ability to do modeling and all those things. That has relevance, but the direct interactions with persons, and especially in junior positions, is helpful.
It's great that you mentioned that. We've talked before about kind of translating the traditional doctoral student experiences into experiences that are more wide-ranging and more consumable for an AltAc marketplace. So I love that you gave us even a different way to think about how you can talk about teaching within this context. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of our session. We were originally scheduled for 60 minutes. I know I asked you before if you might be willing to give us 90.
Sure.
So we're gonna, just as an FYI for everybody, we're gonna keep going for a little bit. If anybody has to jump off, totally understand. We've hit most of my, hey bud, my dog's waking up, so he gets to join our conversation right now.
Lovely.
We've hit most of the big kind of large questions that I had, but one thing that we really like to do when we have a rock star who's in one of these new spaces to us is talk about 3 specific things. What does the hiring process look like? What does the day-to-day of your job look like? And do you have any concrete recommendations for students, RE skills that they could get, experiences to seek out, that sort of stuff? So let's start with, if you don't mind, let's start with what does your day-to-day look like?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. My day-to-day is it's very much a combination of 2 things. Fairly standard processes where you're reviewing contracts, you're reviewing paperwork to make sure that, again, it's in keeping with bank policies. And in most of our programs, that's a prerequisite before government can actually spend resources that we've loaned to them, that we've given our okay to this particular contract or this particular activity to go forward. right? So a lot of it is that. Um, but I think a good 50% is very dynamic. A good 50% is based around having conversations with stakeholders to develop more effective policy solutions and innovate in new areas. So, I'll be talking with um, researchers, for example, in the University of Rochester, right? To really understand how their model on integrating family systems therapy could be brought into, say, 3 or 4 Caribbean states, right? And it's very much that very nice kind of conversation of, okay, tell me about your research, tell me about the outcomes of interest, how do you measure that? And then what do you think you'd be able to do within this context that's similar? Where do you think the challenges are that we have to maneuver around? So a big part of it is doing that kind of innovative, cool, nice stuff. Another part I think is also really, how do I put this? It's it's relationship management. Yeah, it's about being able to maintain good, positive conversation, good rhythms of conversation with government partners. That might be being able to just gauge who's more akin to having discussions via WhatsApp, because some government actors, they prefer just having that kind of nice rhythm of just reach. Others is being thoughtful about the formal correspondence and the approaches you have to keep going and maintaining, because it's always important that you maintain a presence in the minds of government, that they always think if there's an issue that's vexing them, that they can call on you and you can give them good policy advice, technical support, financial support, right? Think of it really as a bank and its client who's looking to start a business. It's that whole idea of nurturing that relationship. So much of it is paperwork, some of it is innovative design and preparation and piloting, and a good chunk is just relationship management.
So interesting. What would you say is the usual pace of your work? I know you talked about in general when researchers come into this space, it's good to be flexible with your timelines, as well as maybe having to pivot your topic matter at kind of like a moment's notice or something like that. So what would you say is kind of the usual pace once something gets started?
I'll be honest, it's never as fast as I personally would like it to be. Projects that you think can get off the ground in 3 months take 6 to 9 months, and that's always the expectation, where a lot of the processes depend on others taking the time to kind of complete their work. And that process, and it's not just in the international world, certainly working, in the US context, it's similar in terms of criminal justice institutions there, right? Like oftentimes research and that kind of work is secondary to what their day-to-day requirement is on their JD. So
you are speaking my language right now.
It takes a little longer for them to respond, unfortunately. So yeah, it's a little longer, but in terms of how my rhythm of work goes, like I pretty much work standard 9 to 7 kind of outlay. And because I have a good team, for any project, I normally have people who will support me in terms of doing some of the technical analysis. So I can always delegate stuff to them and have them do the work, which certainly frees me up. But that's where I have to use that time and invest it in something else, whether it's, again, client relationship management, or in terms of thinking about what other innovative way we can use to make some solution more cogent, more accepted in the region.
Interesting. So where are you based out of? Where are you and your colleagues based out of? Are you constantly traveling with the sort of work that you do?
Yeah, I think, I've been through probably 3 passports in a 5-year period, because there's a lot of traveling.
Wow.
And it's just really back and forth. And I think it's positive, because I can't imagine doing this work without being on the ground in any country for some of these conversations. I can tell you right now, for example, I'm in Houston, Texas with my family, but I'm supposed to be in Georgetown, Guyana, right, in South America. But because of COVID and what have you, I'm actually away. And it makes it difficult to maintain some of those relationships when you're speaking only via virtual settings, right? A lot of the relationships, and this is what I experienced when I was working in Africa as well, a lot of these relationships, the cultures expect you to be present. They anticipate that the conversations they have with you can be held in confidence, and mostly that's based on face-to-face interaction. So there's a healthy, I don't want to say distrust, but there's a healthy caution around virtual conversations where you don't get the full disclosure. And so, yeah, I think in so many ways, traveling has to be a part of what you want to do if you want to work in this space. You have to be willing to visit a country for 3 or 4 days just to have a conversation with a minister, right? Just for 3 or 4 days and come back, because that's what's going to move things forward.
So let's talk about hiring. Now that we talked about what happens once you get the job, let's, the logical thing is to then talk about hiring first, not the other way around, like I should have done. So taking a step back, let's transport back to a time when you were on the job market. How does one even search for jobs in the international justice policy research space?
You have to make a name for yourself before. That doesn't mean you have to be a celebrity. It's just that you have to own a space where you are doing really good work and people are aware of that, right? I think in my interactions with academics who I've seen grow through their different experiences from grad school onwards, it's where they would have, from grad school, probably just kind of sat with a professor and said, hey, if you're doing international work, can I piggyback? Can I do whatever I need to do to get involved? And build the confidence of that professor to have you as a real partner in the research, right? And that's fairly standard. But then the next thing is being willing to travel, right? And be in the field. I think that that's something that you almost can't work in the space unless someone can look at your CV and see that you've actually taken the time, not just to have done research on international matters, but have sat in the context of an international setting. Right? I think that's critical. And in so doing, you start building your network, right? Through the professor and through the relationships you have in those countries. And I think once you have those relationships, you go very, very far away. Because in my case, I was hired because the bank saw me, an academic who already had a pre-existing network and I already had a fair knowledge, a fair depth of knowledge about the context in which they're asking me to work in, right? There's a sense in which working in the Caribbean and some of these countries is always seen as hazard work, because it can be hazardous in some settings, right? You definitely don't have all of the benefits that you might expect in a North American context. But once you get past that, you start to, I think, define yourself as somebody who's willing to travel, who's willing to exist in these spaces, and who knows people in these spaces. You become extremely appealing because there aren't many people like that. And I think in some ways, my hiring process with the bank really reflected them saying, well, you clearly are one of the stronger candidates because you also have not just a local context, but you've also worked and studied in the North American context. So you can also speak at the level that we would speak at, even if it differs from the local context, right? You have a grasp of the theories, you have a grasp of the language, you have a grasp of what's coming up. So yeah, I think for me, those were some of the key things about my hiring process, what I brought to the table again, and the networks that I had already established.
So I have a couple more questions about hiring, but you mentioned something that I do wanna talk about really quickly, which is, super easy question. Do you think it's important for people who wanna break into this space to have non-Western experiences?
And by Western, you're speaking to?
Like Western world, kind of, American-centric lens.
No. I think there are 3 ways, and one of those includes a strictly Western perspective. Right? You can start out with having just done your research in a North American context and still do meaningful work in the Caribbean, Latin America, North Africa, Middle East. If you're willing to transpose the ideas and the concepts, or essentially abstract your theory and test it in another context, right? You can do that from the comfort of your respective institution, right? You can literally get a data set on public opinions and criminal justice um, in the Middle East and do a comparative analysis and present that paper. And that gets you good traction. Um, and I want to be fair too, because I think most academics who I encounter are from that model, where they're primarily based in the US. Most of their understanding and experiences come from the US, but they've been able to, in some ways, transpose or do comparative analysis to facilitate them having enough knowledge to have dialogue in a non-Western context. A second way that people don't really think about, but I think is really important, is there are institutions, and going back to the AltAc, there are law enforcement institutions in the US who have need for citizens who will learn, understand these international contexts. I always reflect back on conversations I've had with like the training director for the FBI, where he said, listen, people don't understand how important it is for us that we start to extend our lens beyond the domestic setting, even as the FBI, and recruit persons who have language skills, right? But also who have an understanding and an interest in understanding what's happening outside of the United States. Mm-hmm. And that's still very much a need. If I spoke with him today, he'd still tell me that, yes, we are still looking to recruit persons into the FBI, into the CIA, who are willing to understand the drug markets, right, in Latin America, who are willing to understand the trafficking rings that extend from Eastern Europe into Colombia, into the US, for example, right? Those kind of intricate kind of dynamics. So that's another space. And then, of course, you have persons who, as I said, are willing to exist in the international world, who are willing to visit countries, travel in these countries, and build up a local network in these countries. I think you can exist in any of those three spaces and do equally well and contribute.
Wonderful. So I want to get to see if you have any other, you've been sprinkling suggestions for students throughout this whole discussion, but I would like to ask one or two more questions about hiring. What does the application and interview process look like? Is it kind of more of a traditional panel interview? What was your experience with that, with your different experiences in international spaces?
Yeah, I think it's fairly standard. Where you definitely go through the initial vetting. So you see it on LinkedIn or on DevX, you apply, they're going to do their shortlisting, and based on just what they see on paper, right? So it's very important how you represent yourself. And again, this is fairly generic. But once you get past the paper stuff, you are going to get interviewed either by an individual and then a panel, or a panel then an individual. I know the bank doesn't like this, the World Bank doesn't like this. IMF, most of these multilaterals, you do it similarly, where you first get a collection of your superordinates, your colleagues, and maybe a subordinate to interview you, and really do a 360 analysis of you as an individual, your fit for the organization, your understanding of the issues, your ability to work within that context. And then they will normally have you meet with your line supervisor, right? Because it's important for them always to give the sign off, right? Like if I'm taking on staff, they're not going to hire that person, no matter what the panel says, unless I've had a chance to sit with them and say, yes, I'm comfortable with this person working with. So yeah, those are fairly standard. You probably will always get that component where they're going to give you some tests, some assessment that's quantifiable to really assess, not just, your ability to understand and apply new practices, but in my case, I remember the test also incorporating questions of like ethics and decision making, and what would you do if a minister says he doesn't want to go this route because of this reason? How would you manage that dynamic? So that I think is important. And how applicable that is to other contexts or to other positions, I think it's just as applicable. I think I'm seeing increasingly more and more assessments are being done, and the range of questions that are being posed are very thoughtful. It's not just a regurgitation, it's really asking you to make a decision that is not clear what the right answer is.
Can I jump in here for a second? I think
Sure.
there's something that you have, this sounds a lot like your conversation about relationship management, just in a hiring process.
Yeah.
And I think this is really the first time we've explicitly talked about this. And I don't know why we haven't thought about this, but this is one of those, and as you've been talking, like all the things you've said, I've thought about, like, these are still things that people would need in traditional academic, right? Like project management
Definitely.
experience, budgeting, translation, relationship management, right? Like these are all skills that will work if you stay traditional academic. And if you go AltAc domestic or AltAc international. And I think you've like found a way to crystallize it, because you're just like, your prose is just so clear. But I think the relationship management part is so important. I think about how I think about my own work doing research, ethnographic research inside of solitary confinement units. Like the level of gatekeeping that is physically and metaphorically happening to get to those spaces is very high. And a lot of it was relationship management. How do I walk into a space and be a legitimate researcher, but also be sensitive to the fact that I'm about to walk in as a female, walk into a male space of restricted housing, and be thoughtful of both myself in their space as a woman, and thoughtful about the ways in which I'm going to talk about what I find to the greater world.
Yes.
And I think that, and at the risk of, they're opening the doors to me, I think in part because they want people to come and see that they're doing the things that they should be doing, but the risk to them is that I could say something really damaging, and being thoughtful that is the conversation. And I think that that's a skill that exists to just access research as a traditional academic, as you're doing work in those spaces. As I think about how in my work now in the AltAc space, the amount of relationship management I do with one of my grants is beyond, right? Like I have two sites in the same project, and one is cool and chill and hip, and the other I'm like very formal. We have to be thoughtful. I'm constantly reinforcing to them, them in their workload, right? And so I just, we haven't really talked about that, but I cannot stress enough how thoughtful and important I think it is. And it's a skill that, it's a soft skill that we don't talk about and we don't really teach, but it matters.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I can't endorse that either enough, Shannon. I think exactly as you put it, the different teams I work with, I manage them differently based on their competencies, based on their maturity levels. And it's always about choosing, to me, to make a different approach that, or let me frame it differently. There's oftentimes, I think, in my context where, because of my leadership role, people expect me to be fairly abrupt, right? And very transactional in nature. And I find that, or at least I tried to do this experiment where I try to go differently. I really try to focus on the individual that I'm working with and make it about how they're developing, make it about how they are progressing. Because to me, that's how you'll get the best out of it. And it's not always easy. There are times where, yes, you're stuck against hard deadlines. But if you always keep in mind that the client comes first, I think that's a really good bellwether. And thus far, it's served me well. So I think you're exactly right. It's about, again, being reflective and reflexive, being thoughtful about who you are entering into the space, and then being willing to adjust, right? Even if it's uncomfortable to you. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting that flexibility seems to be a theme that's really recurring throughout this discussion and quite a few of our other AltAc Rockstar discussions, in all honesty. And I mean, we've talked about the need to be flexible in timelines, flexible in topic matter that you're kind of looking at, and you're maybe having to like pivot your research methods in order to be more responsive to what's happening on the ground in whatever specific locale you're working at. And now there's this whole new area of flexibility that we have to consider, which is essentially relationship flexibility. That I have a specific communication style and relationship style that I love to have with colleagues, but that might not work with everybody that I'm working with. So I need to sometimes step into my uncomfortable areas in order to really nurture a specific relationship. And just having that wide breadth of soft skills is just so important for all sorts of different positions. So I want to be fully respectful of time. We're now getting to the last 10 to 15 minutes or so of our time. So I'd like to leave a couple moments for questions or just general conversation amongst those of us that are remaining. I know looks like about half of us had to drop off with the additional time, but just want to save some space in case there's any conversation or questions that have arisen from the discussion. Also, thank you so much, Dr. Wilks. This has been so informative. I know we didn't have a specific question that was, like, what are your top 5 tips and tricks for students who want to get into this area? But if you have, given that you've already given so much information, if you have any, last statement or two that you'd love to make that's along that area, we've got that time for that as well.
I've thought about it, Kate, and my sense is I so much more welcome any individual grad student reaching out. You can get my email address from you and asking that question based off where they are. Because I think, as I said, there's so many ways that you can exist in this space and do meaningful work that there are no real global messages I can send that I think go beyond the fact that you've already started in a very good way because you're doing your graduate studies. I don't think I can stress enough how important it is that you decided to go on and do your doctoral studies, because that commands respect in and of itself. And say in every space when I don't always deploy it, but whenever I do deploy the fact that I've done my PhD, it commands a certain level of attention, a certain level of focus on what I say. And when I don't do it, I can see where that's sometimes not there, it's not apparent. So getting your PhD, one, already puts you so far along. And then the next questions of like how exactly you then navigate that space really depends on again, your background, your experiences. You come with, a very diverse perspective born out of experiences and life events, or are you fairly someone who's interested and curious and willing to expand? And yeah, the response is different in those cases. So I'd much rather have those conversations one-on-one with people, and based on that interaction, probably be of help.
Well, based off of what's in the chat, I'm thinking you're already going to have a student or two, somebody reaching out to you. So we will, I know we asked before if you are okay with us sharing your contact information, and you graciously said yes.
Sure.
So when we post this information or this session, the video of this session, we will include your information on that.
No problem.
So don't be surprised if you get some folks reaching out to you.
I'd be thrilled, don't worry.
So at this time, are there any other questions or kind of comment areas that we would like to take a couple minutes to chat about? Otherwise, I think we should give our esteemed guest a couple moments back on his schedule today.
I could ask a question if you have time.
Of course, yeah, sure.
So I'm like especially interested in this because I'm interested in research in the Caribbean. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guyana. And so like you said, you're supposed to be in Georgetown. I'm like, oh, I'm just waiting for some research I do to pay me to go down there again. And for over. But I was curious because I'm doing some work now kind of around juvenile stuff, and I've done some work within the incarceration realm as well. I'm curious your thoughts on how to share research better in the region, because I'm doing this and it's all just in this academic realm, and I'm a student, I'm trying to make some of those academic connections and such, but like, there's just no easy way, I think, to like share the academic research well that I know of.
No, Kayla, great. That's a terrific question. I think, first off, there are others who are working in this space, incorporating Guyana and their research into juvenile justice. If you don't know them, I'm happy to put you in touch with them. How you share this, it's on two levels, right? One, I think in the traditional academic sense, it doesn't change. Having your article, in a peer review setting, right, or placed on a noteworthy blog is going to go very, very far, right? It's going further than even using, and I'll be forthright with this. They do have Caribbean journals that do criminal justice. Those are useful, but they don't break the mold. They don't move the needle in any real magnitude. But if you get published in a well-respected international journal, that does open up, again, opportunities for you to be brought in as a consultant by multilateral agencies, by development partners working, whether in the US, the UK, Canada. So that's the first thing. But if it's none of the traditional academic setting, then you're talking about how do you create these fora for sharing information. And that now is going much more to what your generation is more comfortable doing, which is like working using social media, really creating and convening spaces for that kind of dialogue. Right? There's nothing that limits you from having a similar, and again, credit to Shannon and credit to Kate for facilitating these kinds of spaces, right? Creating that kind of forum that looks specifically at this issue, inviting members of government to speak on it, inviting academia from the region to come together and discuss the issue. And that way to start building your notoriety. I've seen researchers who 12 years ago, when they just graduated, they would do stuff like that. And now they're well-established consultants who are known. And if you want to work in this space, you reach, so many names come to mind. I don't want to embarrass them. But you have so many criminologists who are doing good work and they're go-to persons when we think of that design space. So I really encourage you, create your own forum.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries.
Great tip. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Wilks. This has been absolutely enlightening.
My pleasure.
I've got a new little sign motto to put above my desk. What is relevant to criminal justice is changing. 5 exclamation points. So again, thank you so much. I'm sure you're going to be getting some people reaching out to you, following up from this conversation. So thank you everybody for attending and participating in our session this morning. We do not have our next one scheduled yet, but will be soon. And we will be sending out an email blast with one of Shannon's beautiful posters on it sometime very soon.
Yes, thank you again, Dr. Wilks. I can just echo enough, Kate's commentary and your ability to just really break it down and just help us think through how this works in an international space, which doesn't sound all really that different in practice than these domestic spaces or in academic. And I think that's this demystifying, right? That these spaces are so much hard and we don't know, when in actuality, they're very similar. They use the same skills, just we have to brand them and talk about them differently. And I think your conversation, to Kate's point that what's relevant to criminal justice agencies is changing. I think that conversation is so important. And I love that we're able to say that, because I don't think we get to talk about that enough in this series, that how we look at data, how we look at research questions, how we look at our own positionality and move through those spaces is becoming increasingly important. And we challenge ourselves as scholars and researchers, and particularly who don't have those lived experiences or come from a white lens, as somebody who identifies as white and cisgender, that these things matter as we navigate the world, and really leaning into learning about that and being flexible and being uncomfortable and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think that you're saying that that exists in an international space, but honestly, I think that happens. I think we need to be doing that in academia and in AltAc spaces as well. And I think I just want to commend you for helping us be able to naturally and organically talk about that and reinforce to us that we need to be reminding all of us in all of these series how important that is too.
Thank you guys for having me. This was terrific, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share with the grad students. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, all the best. Take care. Have a great day.
Take care.